The village square of Omaligwe was filled with music and the smell of roasted meat, but Zina was not invited. She stood in the shadows, her face swollen from the slap her stepmother Obidi had given her earlier. Zina watched from behind a tree as her stepsister Chidera danced in a beautiful silk wrapper that had once belonged to Zina's late mother. Suddenly, Obidi spotted her. Before the entire village, the cruel woman dragged Zina into the light, screaming that she was a thief who had tried to steal Chidera's jewelry. The villagers gasped as Obidi ripped Zina's tattered blouse, shaming her in front of the handsome Prince Amadi. Zina's heart shattered as the crowd began to whisper and point. She looked at the prince, hoping for mercy, but Obidi pushed her into the dirt, claiming Zina was cursed. Shaking with tears, Zina turned and ran toward the forbidden forest. She didn't care about the wild animals. She only wanted to disappear. Little did she know, someone was watching from the sky, and the injustice of that moment had stirred a power older than the village itself. If you are watching this video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching my folktale story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. Zina ran until her lungs burned and her feet bled. She reached the banks of the silver stream, a place the elders warned was haunted. As she sat by the water crying, the moon suddenly vanished behind a thick, unnatural cloud. The forest went pitch black. Then a soft, shimmering light appeared on the opposite bank. A man stepped out from the trees. He was tall and remarkably pale, with skin that looked like polished silver and eyes that glowed like stars. He looked weak, stumbling as if he were about to collapse. "I am so hungry," the stranger whispered, his voice sounding like many bells ringing at once. Zina forgot her own pain and fear. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small burnt crust of yam she had hidden for her dinner. It was all she had to eat for the next 2 days. Without hesitation, she walked to the water's edge and stretched out her hand. "Take it, sir," she said softly. As the stranger touched the food, a spark of light flew from his fingers, making the water beneath them turn into liquid silver. Zina stepped back in shock. Who was this man, and why did the earth seem to breathe when he moved?
The stranger ate the dry yam as if it were a royal feast. As he chewed, the silver glow on his skin grew brighter, illuminating the dark forest. "Why do you give your only meal to a ghost?" he asked, his voice echoing. Zina looked down at her bruised arms. "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing," she replied. The man smiled, and for a moment, the moon reappeared in the sky, larger and brighter than ever before. He told Zina his name was Mani, and that he was a traveler who had fallen from a great height. He asked her to meet him there every midnight to share her food, promising that he would tell her stories of the stars. Zina agreed, feeling a strange peace she hadn't felt since her father died. But as she crept back into her hut, she found Obidi waiting behind the door with a heavy wooden stick. Obidi demanded to know where Zina had been and why her skin suddenly smelled like fresh rain and expensive incense. The stepmother's eyes narrowed with greed. She sensed that Zina was hiding a secret, and she was determined to beat it out of her before sunrise. Obidi's stick fell heavily on Zina's shoulders, but a strange thing happened. Every time the wood hit Zina's skin, it made a sound like a drum, and Zina felt no pain at all. Instead, a faint silver mist rose from her back. Obidi screamed in frustration, thinking Zina was using witchcraft. "You will work double tomorrow," Obidi yelled, locking Zina in the small, windowless hut. The next morning, Zina was sent to the forest to gather firewood, but the heavy bundles felt light as feathers. Every bird that flew by dropped a bright, colorful feather at her feet. By the time she returned, she had a basket full of rare herbs and feathers that were worth more than gold. Chidera, who was lazy and spent her days painting her nails, grew jealous. She watched as Zina's skin began to glow with a beauty that no oil could provide. "Mother," Chidera whispered. "Zina is becoming more beautiful than me. The prince will never look at me if she stays in this house." Obidi nodded, her heart filling with black smoke. She decided that if she couldn't break Zina's spirit, she would have to get rid of her permanently by accusing her of a crime the village could never forgive.
That evening, Obidi took her own gold necklace, a gift from the chief, and hid it deep inside Zina's sleeping mat. She then went to the village square, wailing and crying that a thief was among them. The village elders and the chief followed Obidi back to her hut. "Search the orphan's bed," Obidi screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Zina. The guards tossed the mat aside, and the gold necklace fell out, sparkling in the dust. The villagers gasped in horror. Stealing from a mother who had taken you in was a great sin in Omaligwe. The chief looked at Zina with disappointment. "Is this how you repay kindness?" he asked. Zina tried to speak, but no words came out of her mouth. It felt as if Obidi had cast a spell to silence her. Just as the guards moved to grab Zina to take her to the village prison, a sudden cold wind blew through the hut. The candles went out, and the sound of 1,000 silver bells rang in the air. For a split second, the image of a giant glowing face appeared on the wall, and the necklace in the chief's hand turned into a cold, slimy toad. The crowd shrieked and ran back, leaving Zina standing alone in the center of the room. The room fell into a terrifying silence as the toad hopped out of the chief's hand and toward Obidi. The villagers whispered that the ancestors were angry, but Obidi was quick with her tongue. "Look," she screamed, pointing at Zina. "The girl has brought a curse upon us with her witchcraft. She has turned gold into a beast." The chief, trembling with fear, ordered Zina to be tied to the great Iroko tree until sunrise, where the night spirits could judge her. As the guards dragged Zina away, Chidera laughed, whispering in Zina's ear that she would never see the sun again. Zina was bound tightly with rough ropes that cut into her wrists, left alone in the dark as the village went to sleep. But as the moon rose to its highest point, the ropes began to glow with a soft silver light. They didn't break. Instead, they turned into soft silk ribbons that smelled of jasmine. Zina looked up and saw Mani standing before her, his feet not touching the ground. He reached out and touched her forehead, and suddenly the pain from the day's beatings vanished. "They try to bind the wind," Mani said softly, "but the moon always finds a way to shine through the cracks."
Mani untied the silk ribbons and led Zina toward the silver stream once more. "Tonight," he said, "you must not feed me bread. You must feed me your sorrow." He asked Zina to tell him every cruel word Obidi had ever said to her. As Zina spoke, tears fell from her eyes, but they did not hit the ground. They turned into glowing pearls that Mani gathered in his silver palms. For every tear she shed, Mani told her a secret of the village, secrets hidden in the shadows where the moon sees everything. He told her where the chief had hidden the stolen tax money and how Obidi had tricked Zina's father into signing away his lands before he died. Zina felt a new strength rising within her. She was no longer just a victim. She was a keeper of the truth. But as the first light of dawn touched the trees, Mani began to fade. "Go back to the tree," he warned. "Let them think they have won. The prince is coming today to choose a bride, and the light will reveal what the darkness has hidden." Zina hurried back, wrapping the silk ribbons around her arms just as the guards returned. The village was buzzing with excitement because Prince Amadi had announced he would visit every house to find a maiden whose heart was as pure as her face. Obidi spent the morning bathing Chidera in expensive oils and dressing her in the finest lace. She hid Zina in the soot-covered kitchen, ordering her to stay behind the large cooking pots. "If you make a sound, I will sell you to the charcoal burners," Obidi threatened. When the prince arrived at their compound, his horse suddenly stopped and refused to move. He looked at Chidera, who was smiling broadly, but he frowned. "There is a smell of rot in this house," the prince remarked, covering his nose. Chidera's smile faded as she looked down and saw that her beautiful lace dress was turning grey, as if it were covered in dust. Obidi tried to spray perfume, but the scent turned into the smell of stagnant water. The prince turned to leave, but a single clear bird song erupted from the kitchen. It was a melody so beautiful it made the prince's heart ache. "Who is singing in the shadows?" he demanded, pushing past Obidi.
The prince walked into the dark, smoky kitchen and found Zina sitting among the ashes. Even though her face was covered in soot, her eyes shone like the stars Mani had described. As the prince reached out his hand to help her up, Obidi rushed forward and pushed Zina into the fire pit. "She is a servant, my prince. She is mad," Obidi cried. But the fire did not burn Zina. Instead, the flames turned a brilliant silver, washing the soot from her skin and leaving her glowing with a celestial light. The villagers who had gathered outside gasped as Zina stepped out of the fire, her tattered clothes transformed into a gown made of woven moonlight. Chidera screamed in rage and tried to tear the dress, but her fingers were burned as if she had touched a hot coal. The prince knelt before Zina, realizing she was the girl from the festival, the one he couldn't stop thinking about. "I have found the light of Omaligwe," he declared. However, Obidi was not finished. She claimed that Zina had stolen a magical artifact from the forest and demanded a trial by the great oracle. The chief agreed to the trial, fearing that the village would be cursed if they didn't follow tradition. The great oracle lived in a cave behind a waterfall, and it was said that anyone who lied in her presence would be turned to stone. Obidi was confident. She had secretly visited a dark herbalist to get a potion that would protect her and Chidera from the oracle's power. As they walked toward the cave, the sky began to grow dim, even though it was midday. A strange chill filled the air. Zina walked calmly, feeling the pearls Mani had given her warm against her chest. When they reached the cave, the oracle emerged, her face covered in white chalk. "One of you has fed the moon, and one of you has fed the shadows," the oracle chanted. She held up a mirror made of obsidian and told them to look into it. When Chidera looked, she saw a monster with jagged teeth. When Obidi looked, she saw a withered tree with no leaves. But when Zina looked, she saw Mani smiling back at her. The oracle pointed a bony finger at Obidi. "The truth is a heavy burden," she whispered. "Tell us, woman, how did Zina's father really die?"
Obidi's face turned a ghostly pale as the oracle's question echoed through the cave. The dark potion she had swallowed felt like lead in her stomach. She opened her mouth to lie, to say that Zina's father had died of a fever, but her tongue felt thick and heavy. Every time she tried to speak a falsehood, a sharp pain stabbed at her chest. The villagers gathered at the mouth of the cave, their eyes wide with anticipation. Prince Amadi stood close to Zina, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Answer," the oracle commanded, her voice like cracking thunder. Obidi's knees began to shake. She looked at Chidera, hoping for support, but her daughter was too busy scratching at her skin, which had started to break out in itchy gray scales. The pressure in the cave became unbearable, the air thick with the scent of ozone and ancient secrets. Finally, unable to hold the lie any longer, Obidi's voice broke. "I didn't kill him," she shrieked, but the way she gripped her throat told a different story. The shadow of a large silver hand appeared on the cave wall, pointing directly at her heart. "I only took what should have been mine," Obidi finally confessed, her voice high and shrill. She admitted that she had swapped her husband's medicine for a bitter herb that made his heart stop, all so she could control the family's wealth before Zina was old enough to inherit it.
A collective gasp rose from the villagers. The betrayal was deeper than anyone had imagined. The chief stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You murdered a son of Omaligwe for gold?" he barked. But before the guards could seize her, Obidi pulled a small black gourd from her wrapper. She smashed it on the ground, releasing a thick, pungent smoke that blinded everyone in the cave. In the confusion, she grabbed Zina by the hair, pulling a jagged stone knife from the shadows. "If I cannot have the riches this girl brings, then the moon will have nothing but her blood," she screamed. The prince lunged forward, but the smoke was too thick. Zina felt the cold stone against her neck, but she didn't scream. She whispered a name, Mani. As the name left Zina's lips, the roof of the cave seemed to dissolve into liquid light. A beam of pure moonlight shot down, hitting Zina and Obidi. The force of the light was so powerful that it threw Obidi backward, the stone knife shattering into 1,000 pieces. When the smoke cleared, Zina was standing unharmed, but Obidi was pinned to the wall by shadows that looked like grasping hands. Mani appeared, not as the weak traveler, but as a towering figure of silver light. The villagers fell to their faces in worship. "You seek to spill blood under my watch?" Mani's voice shook the very foundations of the earth. He turned his gaze to the chief and the elders. "You allowed this orphan to be trampled while you feasted. You looked away from the injustice because it was silent." The chief trembled, realizing that the stranger Zina had been feeding was the protector of their land. Mani reached out and touched the pearls around Zina's neck, and they flew into the air, circling the cave like tiny glowing stars. The pearls began to grow, transforming into large hovering mirrors that showed scenes from the past. The villagers watched in silence as the mirrors revealed Obidi stealing Zina's food, Chidera slapping her in the middle of the night, and the secret meetings where they plotted to ruin her. The evidence was undeniable. Chidera began to cry, but her tears were black and oily, staining her expensive clothes. The prince looked at Zina with tears in his own eyes, ashamed that he hadn't seen the truth sooner. "What shall be their fate, Mani?" the oracle asked, bowing low. Mani looked at Zina. "The moon only reflects what is given to it. Zina has fed me kindness. They have fed the world poison. The choice of justice belongs to the one who suffered." Zina looked at her stepmother, who was now begging for mercy, the same mercy she had never shown. The village waited, the silence so deep you could hear the heartbeat of the forest. Zina stepped toward the woman who had made her life a living nightmare. Zina looked into Obidi's terrified eyes. For a moment, everyone expected her to demand their execution. Instead, Zina spoke with a calm that chilled the air. "You forced me to walk in the dark so no one would see my face," Zina said softly. "You wanted me to be a ghost, so a ghost you shall be." She turned to Mani and asked that Obidi and Chidera not be killed, but that they be stripped of everything they had stolen. Mani nodded, and with a wave of his hand, the silver light stripped away the fine silk and gold jewelry from the two women. Their skin became dull and grey, and their voices were taken away, leaving them only able to hiss like the toads they had become in spirit. They were banished to the outskirts of the village, forced to scavenge for scraps, just as Zina once had. The village square was then filled with a sudden miraculous growth of flowers and fruit trees, a sign that the curse of injustice had been lifted. But the greatest twist was yet to come. Mani turned to Zina and offered her a choice: to stay and be a queen or to travel beyond the clouds. The village fell into a stunned silence as they awaited Zina's answer. Prince Amadi stepped forward, his eyes pleading. "Zina, the palace is yours. You would be the fairest queen Omaligwe has ever seen," he said, his voice trembling with genuine affection. Zina looked at the prince, then at the shimmering, ethereal Mani. She realized that while the prince offered a throne, Mani offered the entire universe. However, she noticed the sadness in the eyes of the village children who had also suffered under the chief's neglect. "I cannot leave yet," Zina announced. "A queen's duty is to her people, but a light's duty is to the world." Mani smiled, his silver face glowing with pride. He reached into the air and pulled out a silver staff, handing it to Zina. "This staff will guide you. As long as you feed the hungry and protect the weak, the moon will never set on your prosperity." As Mani began to ascend back into the night sky, the silver clothes Zina wore remained, but they felt as light as air. She was no longer just an orphan. She was the guardian of the light. With the moon spirit back in the heavens, the village began to change. The chief, fearing the power Zina now held, stepped down from his throne, handing his beaded crown to the prince. But the transition of power was not as smooth as Zina hoped. On the outskirts of the village, in the damp shadows of the forest, Obidi and Chidera were not sitting idly. Though they had lost their voices and their beauty, their hearts were still filled with a poisonous rage. They had found shelter in a cave belonging to an outcast sorcerer who traded in dark shadows. Obidi used her hands to scratch symbols into the dirt, showing the sorcerer the silver staff Zina now possessed. The sorcerer, a man with eyes like charcoal, saw the power within the staff and hungered for it. He promised Obidi that if she helped him steal the staff, he would restore her voice and make her the most powerful woman in the land. A new, darker mystery was brewing while the village celebrated. Unaware of the looming threat, Zina began her work. She used the silver staff to heal the sick and bring rain to the parched farms of the poor. The people who once mocked her now bowed low, calling her the mother of moonlight. Prince Amadi spent every day by her side, learning how to lead with kindness instead of fear. However, Zina started noticing that every time she performed a miracle, a small patch of darkness appeared on the moon. She grew worried. One night, while resting in the palace gardens, she heard a familiar hissing sound. She turned to find a trail of black slime leading toward the treasury. She followed the trail, only to find the guards fast asleep under a spell of heavy slumber. At the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in shadows, holding a bag that seemed to swallow all light. The figure turned, and Zina saw a face that looked like a twisted version of her own. "Who are you?" Zina demanded, raising her staff. The shadow chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rubbing together. "I am the part of you that you tried to bury, Zina," the shadow replied. It was a phantom created by the sorcerer using a lock of Zina's hair that Obidi had kept from years ago. The shadow claimed that for every blessing Zina gave, it would take a curse from the moon. It lunged at her, and as their spirits clashed, the silver staff began to hum with a frantic energy. The prince, awakened by the noise, rushed into the room, but he couldn't see the shadow. He only saw Zina fighting the air. He thought she was having a fit and tried to hold her, but the shadow used the prince's touch to drain Zina's energy. Zina felt herself growing weak, her silver glow fading to a dull gray. The shadow laughed, reaching for the staff. "The moon is tired of feeding you, Orphan," it hissed. Just as the shadow's fingers touched the staff, the ground began to shake. The silver staff didn't let the shadow take it. Instead, it grew hot, burning the shadow's hands. Zina realized that the shadow was feeding on her doubt. She closed her eyes and remembered the taste of the dry yam she had shared with Mani. She remembered that her power didn't come from the staff, but from the kindness in her heart. With a cry of defiance, she embraced the shadow instead of fighting it. "I accept the pain you represent," she whispered. The shadow shrieked as it was absorbed back into Zina's light. The darkness on the moon vanished instantly. But as the light returned, Zina saw the sorcerer standing at the palace gates, with Obidi and Chidera behind him, leading a small army of possessed forest creatures. The real battle for Omaligwe had just begun, and the prince's sword was useless against the magic of the deep woods. The sorcerer raised his gnarled hands, and the trees at the edge of the village began to walk, their roots tearing through the earth like giant claws. Obidi and Chidera stood behind him, their faces twisted with a silent, hateful glee. The villagers screamed, running for cover as the possessed wooden giant smashed through the village walls. Prince Amadi rallied his men, but their arrows simply bounced off the thick back of the monsters. Zina stepped forward, her silver staff pulsing with a steady heartbeat-like rhythm. She realized the sorcerer was drawing power from the hatred Obidi felt. "You cannot build a kingdom on a foundation of spite," Zina shouted. The sorcerer laughed, sending a bolt of black lightning toward her. Zina raised her staff, and the light reflected the bolt back, striking one of the wooden giants. But for every monster that fell, 2 more seemed to rise from the shadows. The sky turned a deep blood red as the moon began to withdraw its light, frightened by the ancient darkness the sorcerer had unleashed. Zina knew she had to find the source of the sorcerer's heart, or the village would be buried in timber and shadow before the sun could rise. In the heat of the battle, Zina noticed that the sorcerer was standing on a patch of earth that remained perfectly still. Below his feet lay the black god Obidi had used in the cave, now glowing with a sickly purple light. That was the anchor of his power. Zina called out to Prince Amadi, telling him to distract the sorcerer while she reached the god. Amadi, showing the courage of a true king, charged forward with a torch, setting fire to the brush around the sorcerer. As the villain turned to extinguish the flames, Zina shifted into a streak of silver light. She dove toward the god, but Chidera, moved by a final spark of jealousy, threw herself in Zina's way. The 2 girls tumbled into the dirt. Chidera's hands, still scaly and cold, gripped Zina's throat. "If I am a ghost, you will be a corpse," Chidera's eyes screamed. Zina didn't strike back. Instead, she looked at Chidera with pity. "Is this the life you wanted, sister? To be a slave to a sorcerer's darkness?" For a split second, Chidera's grip loosened. That moment of hesitation was all Zina needed. She rolled away and struck the black god with the base of her silver staff. The vessel shattered, and a sound like 1,000 trapped souls screaming erupted from the shards. The sorcerer let out a horrific wail as his shadow magic began to implode, sucking him into a vortex of his own making. The wooden giant instantly collapsed, turning back into harmless logs. The sorcerer reached out for Obidi, trying to pull her into the void with him, but she scrambled backward in terror. With a final flash of purple light, the sorcerer vanished, leaving only a scorched circle on the ground. The village was saved, but the silence that followed was heavy. Obidi and Chidera lay in the dust, exhausted and broken, their alliance with evil having failed them. The villagers emerged from their homes, looking at the wreckage and then at Zina. She stood there, her silver dress torn and her hair dusty, yet she looked more like a deity than ever before. The next morning, the village of Omaligwe gathered for a final judgment. The prince, now the official king, sat on the throne with Zina by his side. Obidi and Chidera were brought before them in chains. The people demanded their heads for bringing the sorcerer to their gates. But Zina held up her hand. "Blood only calls for more blood," she said. She looked at Obidi and Chidera and decreed that they would be banished to the far mountains, where they would spend their lives planting trees to replace the ones the sorcerer had destroyed. They would never be allowed to return, and they would remain silent until they performed 1,000 acts of genuine kindness. As the guards led them away, Obidi finally looked at Zina with a hint of regret, realizing she had traded a daughter's love for a pile of ash. The prince then turned to Zina and took her hand. "The palace is ready for its queen," he whispered. Zina smiled, but she looked up at the daytime moon, which was still visible in the pale blue sky. Zina chose to stay as the queen of Omaligwe, but she never moved into the golden rooms of the palace.
Instead, she built a small house by the silver stream where any hungry traveler could find a meal. She and King Amadi ruled for 50 years, and it was said that during their reign, no child went hungry and no orphan felt alone. Every night, Zina would leave a bowl of fresh fruit and bread on a silver altar for Mani, and in return, the moon shone so brightly on Omaligwe that they never needed lamps. The story of the girl who fed the moon became a legend told to every generation. The story you have just heard is a beautiful African tale I heard long ago. I'm telling you to wake your mind to the truth that kindness is a seed that grows into a forest of protection. If you were Zina, would you have forgiven those who tried to destroy you, or would you have demanded justice in blood? I want to know your opinion because every story is like a candle that can light the path for someone else. God bless you, and may courage guide your hands. Meanwhile, on the final screen, I am leaving you with one of the channel's most beloved folk tales. I am sure you'll love it. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.